Professor Mason and myself, Melvin Freestone, would like to share some ideas with you around questions and appraisal of curiosity. We come from educational backgrounds, but we believe that some of what we're going to say might have societal implications as well. Our talk is based on a number of assumptions. Questions engage curiosity. Questions direct learning. Questions generate thinking. They reveal connections, and in so doing, build understanding. To begin with, we'd like to share with you a framework of three sets of questions. The framework is a process, a continuous process of opening up and closing down, an iterative process as well. The first set of questions are generic generative questions. We have identified 12, each of them labeled with a single word and a brief description. For example, function, how does it work? Everything has a purpose, a role to play, or a way of behaving and operating. Or down the bottom of the list, innovation, how might new ideas help? Expression of creativity and imagination develops different ideas and ways of acting. These 12 are by no means a definitive list, but we believe they encompass the broad range of human endeavor. And of course, it's impossible to deal with all 12 at once. It requires a selection in our experience of 2 or 3, based on the nature of the inquiry, the purpose of the investigation, the content and context of the inquiry. But as they stand, they have relatively little meaning until translated into the context and the content of the inquiry. We think of that by means of consequent questions. We've taken the COVID example to illustrate what this might mean. Consequent questions translate generic generative questions into questions that are investigatable. In the case of COVID-19, how does COVID-19 invade the human body? Could COVID-19 be transferred in different ways? In what ways could a COVID-19 vaccine be developed? If we go down to the bottom of the screen, the ethical generic generative question. Consequent questions might be, what responsibilities do people and communities have in limiting a COVID-19 outbreak? Could enforcing a lockdown become a denial of human rights? Very topical right now. The point here is that consequence questions are practicable. They can be done, they can be investigated, but they are directed by the particular generic generative questions selected. Sometimes consequent questions are not enough. Need to go further and identify pointed questions, questions that are more precise, more carefully attuned to the context in which the investigation is taking place. What are the interacting elements in how the virus invades the body? In what ways might difficulties and faults be predicted? Again, sticking with COVID in the ethical one, how might proposed actions be culturally and ecologically responsible? And are there any conflicts, and what could they be about? So these 3 sets of questions operate as a sequence in our view, an iterative sequence. But generally speaking, it's good to start with the generative questions so that you can get a purposeful direction into inquiries, and the consequent questions, practical and doable investigations. So what then are the key features of each of these? Generic generative questions are situational because they reflect or bound by the particular content and context of the inquiry that's been undertaken. They're intentional because they involve a selection, down to a few. And as a consequence, they're directional. And of course, they're framed. Consequent questions are purposeful. They translate inquiries into action. They're nuanced, they're personalized to the people who selected them, and they're customized to the content of the inquiry. Pointed questions oftentimes tend to be spontaneous, or more spontaneous, but they're more precise. And when these three sets of questions are in mind, inquiries with purpose, with enhanced purpose, can be undertaken. Might involve action research, using the classical way, say, of plan, act, and review, and have features that look for the best of what is, what could be, what should be, and what will be. In other words, appreciative inquiry. In our view, questions and questioning are different. They're often confused and used synonymously. Questions are strategic. They direct. They shape. Questioning is concerned with doing it, getting on with it, tactical, putting inquiries into practice. Questioning is shaped by questions, questions being the leading factor. Design-orientated or design orientation, strategic questions. And action orientation, more towards tactical questioning. The 12 generic generative questions can be thought of or applied or focused upon at different levels of sophistication. We've used 4 labels: observation, explanation, interrelationship, and extrapolation. In the case of function, the example we've taken, different features in a natural or human-built system work together. That is less sophisticated than the extrapolation. Under the heading of extrapolation, design principles on which a system is based informs future advances. Depending upon the level at which the generic generative question is thought of and pitched, focused upon, it would of course shape the depth and breadth of an inquiry. I've also outlined ethical in red, but unfortunately we don't have time to go into it right now, but you can look at it in more detail through the paper. Each of these generic generative questions open up big ideas for exploration. Some of these are listed for function and ethical, the examples we've taken. So when you're thinking about COVID-19, some of the big ideas that related to exploring the questions asked might involve looking at designs and intentions, effectiveness and efficiency, power and energy, processes and mechanisms, and so on, and many more things. On the ethical side, it might be beliefs and traditions, might be outcomes and benefits, equity and equality, again, and so on. So these questions open up big ideas for exploration, and the rest of the 10 other generic generative questions are illustrated. Again, by no means definitive lists, indicative only. When it comes to profiling question-led inquiries, we would propose or make the proposition that there are 3 stages. First is that given the generic generative questions that have been selected, consider the possibilities. Work out the scope of possibility that was implied in or involved in exploring those questions through the consequent questions that had been identified. And then collect evidence during, the beginning, during, and at the end of the inquiry, throughout an inquiry, a broad range of evidence, written material, visual material, film material, anecdotal records, models, etc. And if that evidence becomes too voluminous, it can always be culled according to that which is most valuable. Indeed, in K-12 learning situations, the culling exercise in itself is valuable. And once that evidence is to hand, profiling performance is in terms of breadth and depth of an inquiry, breadth and depth of understanding, breadth and depth of learning. The assessment of curious question-led inquiries needs to be comprehensive. Tests, standardized tests, and common assessment tasks have value, but they're only one piece of evidence. The evidence needs to be comprehensive across the range of activity that's gone on in an inquiry. And because it's comprehensive and it involves what people are actually doing, it's authentic and therefore likely to be reliable. But once that is all to hand and judgments are made about the quality of the learning, the quality of an inquiry, the quality of understanding or learning, then unbalanced judgments tend to be more dependable than taking the best that's there or the least good. And once the unbalanced judgments are to hand, they can be mapped, we would argue, in terms of progress and development. I've taken 5 criteria: scope of subject matter, consistency of performance, collaboration with others, organization of inquiry, depth of thinking, and mapped that on 5-point scale from the center going outwards of performance. The dashed lines represent 2 different people, each of them having quite different profiles of achievement in this example. But all this begs the question of how or what ways can one interpret depth and breadth of understanding, breadth and depth of an inquiry, breadth and depth of learning. Well, let's go back to what we had before. Observations, explanations, interrelations, and extrapolations are increasingly sophisticated. And within each of them is embodied a process, a proximal development zone, and a cycle of learning moving from unistructural, one thing involved, to many things involved, multi-structural, to relating those many things together, relational, and happening at each of the 4 levels. And then on the breadth side, we can observe or interpret what's going on in terms of inactive activity, that is what people are actually doing, the iconic activity, how they're relating things and representing what's happening or what they think should happen or what the designs are, and then to symbolic activity, which tends to be more towards language and number, and in molecular biology indeed to complex diagrams. Breadth and depth of learning, breadth and depth of understanding, breadth and depth of inquiry. Another way of looking at it is to consider maturation of thinking capabilities or maturation of dialogue capabilities. And as you move outwards in the diagram, you move towards complex understanding and increasing uncertainty in dialogue. How might you observe it? Well, through a condition of technicality, moving to a condition of judgment, moving to a condition of complexity. Some of the features are listed in the diagram, just to take a couple for a minute. Is it relational or managed, what's going on and what's being produced? Or is it very much shaped or flavored by, colored by possibility, nuance, and adaptation? What we've presented is broad in scope. It has implications, we would argue significant implications for teaching and learning practice. What if the framework of 3 sets of questions were to be strongly influenced or strongly involved in the way in which learning activities in schools were set up? Curriculum design, much of it is about content at the moment. Descriptions of contents, prescriptions of content. What if curriculums were organized around questions? We're actually trying to do that right now. And of course, digital resources require a structure. The United Nations has shown that the structure should be strongly reflect pedagogical understandings. Again, if what we've said here were to form part of the structure for digital resources, it might enhance their effectiveness. Computer-based programs are the same. What we're putting here is very different from invariant sequences of some computer-based programs. Online conferencing. This conference could have been organized around the framework of 3 sets of questions that we discussed earlier on. And the assessment of how well it went could be based on some of the things about profiling that we've said. And then equally important, if the framework of questions were used frequently by people, and they become almost habitual, they would help to empower people in dealing with everyday life challenges. The key thing, of course, is innovation. Co-design is strong. Co-construction is strong. Personalized challenges equally strong. And customized inquiries emphasized. Thank you very much.